Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to what is the third session of Social Work Week 2025. And to this event, Retention in Adult and Children's Social Work, a New Theory of Change. I know this is going to be an incredibly interesting session, and we're really pleased that you're able to join us today. Our presenter today is Dr. Laura Cook, Associate Professor and Director of the Centre for Research on Children and Families at the University of East Anglia. Any views, information or opinions expressed by third parties during Social Work Week are the speaker's own and don't reflect the views of Social Work England. Social Work England haven't endorsed third-party content and are not liable for the content of sector-led sessions.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that introduction, Laura. As Laura said, my name is Laura Cook, and I'm an Associate Professor in the School of Social Work here at the University of East Anglia. And this afternoon, I'm going to be introducing a theory of change to support the retention of social workers. But before I do, I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of our excellent project team, Dr. Kate Blake-Holmes, Yusuf Ibn Abdullah, and Dr. Sarah Carter, all of whom worked on this project. So, of course, the retention of social workers is a long-standing issue in both children and adult social work, nationally and internationally. And we know that the failure to retain social workers has very important implications for those using services and also has an economic impact. The reasons why social workers leave the profession are familiar to many of us here this afternoon. High caseloads, increased bureaucracy against a backdrop of ever decreasing local authority budgets. However, we also know that many social workers do stay and in fact do thrive in their work. And the research I'll be talking about today starts from this very positive position. In our research, we've learnt from stayers, social workers who've remained in their role, about what sustains and motivates them and what helps them to find ongoing meaning and emotional rewards in their practice. The theory of change we've developed draws on two linked research studies undertaken here at the University of East Anglia. In total, these two studies have captured the voices of over 109 practitioners across 12 local authorities in England. I'll begin by outlining the first study and then explain how we developed and expanded the concepts via our second study, and I'll conclude by introducing the resulting theory of change to support retention in social work. Links to the research report, the articles, will be provided in the chat during the session so you can find out more about the project. So our research started back in 2019 when we were funded by the British Academy and Leverhulme Trust to identify what helps our experienced social workers to stay in the profession, especially in frontline and child protection teams, areas with particularly high staff turnover. As part of this research, we had the very great privilege of speaking to 58 experienced social workers from across 11 local authorities in England. All had stayed beyond the average tenure, having 8 years or more post-qualifying experience in practice. And we interviewed each of our 58 social workers for up to an hour each, and they shared with us the story of their career, the experiences that had really shaped them as a social worker. And we asked them about what helped them to stay when times got tough in the profession. Some of them had been in the profession for up to 40 years, and so they had really immense perspective on social work as a profession, what it's like to be a social worker over the course of a long and fruitful career. Our analysis of social workers' career stories allowed us to identify several key factors that shape retention. The first of these factors was professional identity, which played a really key role in retention. For this group of highly experienced practitioners, social work was an intrinsic and important part of their identity. With the exception of one participant who described social work as just a job, all participants in the study described social work as a defining feature of who they were as a person, solidified through their years in practice. Social workers' representations of being a social worker, their professional identity, encompass their core values, their beliefs, their personality, skills, and their fundamental sense of purpose. A degree of separation between work and home life was acknowledged by all of our social workers to be important. However, what was really interesting was that for this group of experienced stayers, the personal and the professional were inextricably linked. They described social work as a 24/7 state of being, and they approached their personal relationships in a way that was congruent with their work identity and vice versa. They described themselves as avid observers of human behaviour, people watchers on the bus and in cafes. They described themselves as good listeners who inevitably found themselves social working their friends, family, and at times even strangers. One social worker, for instance, told me how her son had complained they couldn't even go to Tesco without her finding out the life story of the cashier. Over the years, social work had really become a way of life, and this had strengthened their resolve to stay in the profession. In fact, for many of the social workers we spoke to, it was hard for them to imagine who they would be without social work. As one social worker described, being a social worker, it's in my DNA now. Being a social worker is like breathing, it's in your bones after 10 years. This strong sense of professional identity could act as a buffer to the stresses of the role. For instance, social workers describe drawing on their sense of vocation, their desire to make a difference, and their core social justice values to cope with the often very intense demands of child and family social work. Staying in the profession over the long term involved navigating what we conceptualised as critical career episodes, or CCEs. CCEs were defining moments in social workers' careers which were emotive, challenging, and represented stay or go moments. CCEs typically arose due to a threat to the social worker's sense of professional identity. For instance, one social worker described a time in her career where she felt that she was forced to practice in a way that wasn't congruent with her values and her ethics. During this period of her career, she described feeling like she was just putting kids into a processing machine and hoping for the best. Other social workers described similar identity threats which arose from their practice. For instance, some spoke very movingly about situations where they had fundamentally disagreed with their organisation about a decision that was made about a child, which conflicted with their view of what social workers should do and should be. Another spoke of the first time she'd needed to remove a child from a family, and the sense of dissonance that came from her deeply held ethical commitment to improve the lives of children and families, yet finding herself causing such profound distress. So CCEs involved a process of often painful self-examination, where workers sought to bring their professional identity and their role back into alignment. This often entailed rationalizations such as, you can't help everyone, or it isn't personal. In other cases, it meant finding the courage to challenge and disagree with other professionals, to find your voice as a social worker. CCEs were therefore often resolved by workers by distilling a moral or a lesson from their difficult experience in a way that allowed them to maintain a positive sense of identity. So CCEs prompted identity work, where social workers ask questions like, am I making a difference? Is my work helping or harming children? Where social workers were able to work through a CCE, this hard-won learning often led to strengthened professional identity and a renewed commitment to stay in the profession. Where they were unable to resolve the CCE, workers often thought about leaving. They became disengaged and experienced burnout. They considered leaving their role. So CCEs were points where social workers were particularly vulnerable to workforce exit. And this suggested to us that support to navigate CCEs is really important for retaining social workers. For experienced stayers, remaining in the profession had meant encountering and navigating several CCEs over the course of their career. They had typically moved around the CCE cycle, which is depicted on the slide, several times, during which time they accrued experience, practice wisdom, and knowledge. So experiencing and resolving these CCEs formed the building blocks of professional identity. And CCEs acted as points of reference throughout social workers' careers. They often looked back at these and drew on the lessons they'd learned in order to approach new challenges as they arose. Experienced stayers also identified the need for ongoing opportunities to develop their professional identity. They wanted to continue to grow personally and professionally, rather than simply to experience what they described as more of the same. Opportunities for specialism, mobility, and generativity were important for ongoing professional development over the career span. So, firstly, experienced social workers were often motivated to stay in the profession where they could develop a specialism, that is, becoming an expert in a particular area of practice. For some, this was being a practice educator or going into management. However, they identified that opportunities for progression outside management were often quite limited in child and family social work. Social workers instead talked about developing their own informal specialisms and areas of expertise. This included court work, child sexual exploitation, domestic abuse, working with adolescents, etc. And typically colleagues would get to know that they had these informal specialisms and they would be consulted and they would advise on these areas. These interests were typically developed through their practice, where they'd encountered a challenging case or a CCE which had provoked new learning. For instance, one participant was given the opportunity by her local authority to use her experience, which was developed across several challenging cases, to develop the local authority's sexual exploitation policy and response team. So, matching specialisms with workers' interests was a mutually beneficial investment for both the individual and the organisation, utilising workers' knowledge, sustaining motivation, and improving retention. Secondly, mobility emerged as a really important factor for sustaining experienced workers in the profession. Participants typically describe moving teams, local authority, or their roles several times during their career as a way to sustain their interest, recapture their love for the work, and sustain them in the profession. They identified that opportunities for mobility were, however, often quite limited, so they created what they described as their own informal secondments by moving teams. Finally, participants identified opportunities for generativity as key to sustaining them over the course of a long career. So the concept of generativity comes from Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. And he argues that there's a life stage called generativity versus stagnation, which takes place in middle age. During this period, the guiding concern for the individual is making a mark on the world through the nurture of things that will outlast us. So, for instance, through parenting, through mentoring, and nurturing others. Similarly, experienced social workers in the middle stages of their career found great value in supporting the next generation of social workers, and they often identified this as a key reason why they stayed in the profession. So our first study, therefore, identified ongoing professional identity development through specialism, mobility, and generativity as key to retention, in addition to support to manage CCEs. So after launching our findings from the first piece of research, we had a really unexpected response. We were contacted by social workers all over the country who felt that the research had captured their experiences of what it meant to be a social worker. They wanted to know from us how they could manage CCEs, and local authorities were interested in how they could support professional identity development and how these ideas could be operationalised in their respective organisations. Interestingly, we were also contacted by social workers outside of child protection who were interested in whether these ideas were applicable to other areas of the social care profession. So this therefore provided the motivation for us to undertake a second piece of research in order to answer some of these questions. So our aim in study 2 was to develop resources and recommendations, concrete guidance to support social workers through critical career episodes. We also wish to explore whether the concepts from study 1, which focused on child protection social workers, were relevant to practitioners outside of child protection. So study 2 used a theory of change approach. So a theory of change identifies why a change or an intervention is necessary, what it seeks to achieve, and identifies potential factors that can hinder or facilitate that change. Theories of change are rooted in evidence from research, in this case the findings from study 1, and involve consultation with key stakeholders to confirm the theory of change. So to develop and confirm our theory of change for retention, we consulted with a broad range of professionals. So this included child and family social workers outside of child protection, but also adult social workers across a range of settings, including social work with adults with disabilities, mental health social workers, and social work with older people. We also consulted with approved mental health professionals, or AMPs, as this is a highly specialist role, and we were interested in the findings from study one, which suggested there was a strong relationship between a strong professional identity, and specialism. We also wanted to explore the relevance of concepts for social care professionals outside of social work. So we aimed to recruit occupational therapists. We had quite a small sample of occupational therapists, so I think we need to be quite cautious about generalising outside of social work. But nevertheless, there are some interesting ideas here, as I'll explain, that may be relevant for practitioners in other professions. So while study one focused on experienced practitioners who had over 8 years in practice, our second study included social workers from all career stages, including those from the first 2 years of practice. Our participants attended a series of up to 4 workshops, during which we asked them to reflect on the relevance of CCEs for their particular area of social work practice. We asked them to help us identify recommendations and assist us to develop our theory of change. So, in study two, we found that the concept of CCEs was indeed really relevant for practitioners across a range of social work roles and career stages. This idea of identity threat, promoting identity work, was a common experience for those in adult and children's social work and for approved mental health professionals. Sorry, I think I've jumped ahead a slide there. Excuse me. Okay. So the process of running the research, running the workshops led to new learning for us. Surprisingly for many participants, the workshops represented the first opportunity for them to really reflect on their career as a whole and themselves as a social worker. Since reflective spaces open to them, such as supervision, tend to be more case focused rather than inviting social workers to consider their career as a whole. What we found was that our workshops were unexpectedly powerful and moving. Practitioners shared cases which had shaped them, experience which had a profound effect on how they understood themselves and their profession. And they helped us to develop a new tool for reflection on critical career episodes, this CCE timeline tool, or CSET, which you'll see the links in the chat will take you to the report where you can find more information about that. What we learned was that recalling CCEs could be difficult, and it involved being vulnerable. We learned a lot from the honesty and bravery of the social workers who participated in our research. Crucially, though, these were also spaces for celebration and achievement and solidarity, as well as a space to share learning. I'm not sure why my slides have gone a little funny there. Okay. The workshops allowed us to further develop and refine the concept of CCEs, thanks to the input from our wide range of social workers who took part. We identified 3 main risk factors that increased the risk of a CCE: transitions, lack of control and autonomy, and management style. So what we learned in study 2 was that professionals were more likely to experience a CCE at points of personal or professional transition. Professional transitions included moving from a student to a first social work role, moving teams or service, or becoming a manager. CCEs were perhaps more likely during these transitions as they represented a threat to practitioners' identity or an identity shift in some way, thus prompting the identity work that I talked about earlier. For instance, when a social worker moved into a team manager role for the first time, they often had to adopt a new identity, and one in which managing the demands of service pressures placed them at odds with their practice values. CCEs were also associated with personal transitions. Professionals spoke of times when a significant change in their personal life had contributed to a CCE. These included becoming a parent, assuming a caring role for unwell or older family members, experiencing menopause, becoming the main breadwinner in the family, etc. For instance, the identity shift involved in becoming a parent had real implications for how social workers conceived of their work with families. And practitioners emphasise to us the need for support around CCEs to acknowledge the personal aspects of a CCE and an approach to supervision which allowed them space to reflect on these personal aspects of CCEs. Secondly, a lack of perceived control or autonomy increased the risk of a CCE. And this could happen for several reasons. For instance, a high caseload could reduce social workers' sense of control over their work. This in turn made it difficult for social workers to practice in a way that was congruent with their professional identity. And service restructure or subsequent forced changes of role could also lead to this perceived lack of control. However, the social workers that we consulted were very realistic. They acknowledged that CCEs prompted questions that very often have no easy answer. For instance, issues around caseloads, lack of resources within organisations, ethical issues, none of these are easy, straightforward answers. However, what helped social workers to manage CCEs in these circumstances was restoring a sense of control wherever possible. So even when they couldn't change the circumstances, social workers really valued having a manager and a team who understood, listened, and allowed them to have, to some degree, a voice in decision making, even when they couldn't obtain the ideal outcome. For instance, being able to have some input into how cases were allocated at a team level, or being meaningfully consulted about service changes, made a real difference for social workers. A striking finding was that all practitioners identified management style as having perhaps the greatest bearing on their intention to stay in their role. Poor management left social workers unable to maintain a positive sense of professional identity and was itself a risk factor for a CCE. By contrast, having a manager who believed that you were a good social worker, even when you didn't feel like it yourself, was key to resolving a CCE and forming a strong intention to stay. In relation to CCEs, managers who provided a space to debrief were highly valued. However, while support for a CCE often involved an immediate debrief, it wasn't the only component. Crucially, effective support around CCEs also involved an ongoing discussion, follow-up and review. Managers who were perceived by their social workers as getting it right provided ongoing support and informal check-ins, often outside of the more formal supervisory spaces available to discuss cases. During the workshops, practitioners helped us to identify what helps to resolve these CCEs. And this helped us to identify these three necessary conditions for the resolution of CCEs. So the first, crucially, was a culture of psychological safety. So psychological safety refers to the belief in a working group that it's safe to take an interpersonal risk, whether this be showing one's own vulnerabilities or having the courage to challenge the status quo in some way. To resolve CCEs, social workers described the need to feel confident that they could express negative emotions or admit to being unsure about their work or indeed their capabilities without fear that they would be viewed negatively for expressing these views. Most participants describe their teams as a major positive and sustaining factor in their work, and their colleagues were a great source of support during a CCE. This suggests that interventions to strengthen teams are likely to be helpful in terms of retention. Without a culture of psychological safety, however, workers could not or might not risk seeking support for fear that they would be viewed as incapable or incompetent. For instance, as one social worker said, you fear that in saying you're struggling, they need you to go to performance management. Those kinds of fears are very real. However, despite experiencing good support in many cases, a minority of social workers described experiences of teams that lacked compassion, where the culture was toxic or simply unsupported. In some cases, this was attributed to the severe and inevitable current pressures on teams, particularly in frontline services with high vacancy rates and turnover. These teams often consisted of relatively inexperienced workers who themselves were finding their way through CCEs during the first 2 years of their career, which can make it difficult for them to provide support to others. Some teams with higher turnover levels were simply just newer than others, and so those deeper relationships that would promote that culture of psychological safety were not yet developed. So while teams were crucially important, there were occasions where inevitably they couldn't meet social workers' needs during times of a CCE. So this is why it was particularly important for social workers to have other complementary psychologically safe spaces to explore CCEs. So resolving CCEs involved a combination of self-reflection and peer support. But crucially, this research highlighted the need for a third space outside of self-reflection in the team in which to focus and reflect on CCEs. This was particularly important for social workers when it was difficulties with their team manager or their team that were at the heart of their particular CCE. As one social worker described, I wish there was a mechanism to discuss CCs with someone else, not your manager. If you divulge everything to the person who is your manager that wants you to get on with the job, it's a bit of a conflict. So one of the local authorities in our study had piloted an intervention for early career social workers, a facilitated peer support group for practitioners in their first 2 years of practice. The group met regularly with a facilitator who was independent of their team of service, and this provided a psychologically safe and independent environment for workforce support. This group was identified by many social workers as key to helping them manage CCEs, and many identified it as playing a significant role in them deciding to stay in the profession. And finally, support for team managers was identified by all practitioners as a real area of unmet need. Team managers were identified, as I said, as a really key factor in retention, and their approach directly contributed to social workers' decisions to remain or leave. However, the unmet needs of team managers emerged as an important theme right throughout both of the research projects. Team managers told us that they felt acutely responsible for the well-being of their teams. However, they often reported little in the way of support or supervision in their role, and not all received supervision themselves. Some were able to receive support from senior trusted members of their team, but they were acutely aware of not wanting to burden their team. Generally, for team managers, there was a focus on what they provided rather than what they needed to keep doing their job. And they identified that their training and management that they received was somewhat patchy. So generally, participants identified a real need for the support and training needs of managers to be reviewed and improved. And also, team managers identified the need for a third space for themselves as team managers, a facilitated group where they could obtain some peer support rather than working in isolation, where they could gain advice from other managers, especially during the transition to their first management role, which was often a difficult and challenging time for team managers. So the risk factors for CCEs and the necessary conditions for their resolution that I've talked about already were really true for social workers across all areas and career stages. However, our consultation with professionals highlighted additional specific considerations at different career stages, and I'll move on to talk about those now. So social workers in the first 2 years of practice were at a much earlier stage of development in terms of their professional identity. They were therefore particularly vulnerable, we learnt, to CCEs. So challenges in their role led them to question who they were as a social worker and whether they had the knowledge, skills and attributes required to social work, and often whether they should be in the profession at all. As one practitioner summarised, during the early career stage, you haven't got the confidence to think, actually, no, this is what's needed, as opposed to, I can't do it, I'm useless. Following a CCE, early career social workers were therefore more likely to consider leaving the profession entirely, compared to more experienced social workers who were themselves much more likely to talk about moving the service or team rather than leaving the profession as a whole. At this career stage, so the early career stage, CCEs often involved a real sense of imposter syndrome. Social workers felt as if they were required to perform as a social worker, yet underneath it they still felt quite unsure of themselves and their professional identity. They also needed to square their expectations and values around what it meant to be a social worker with the pressured realities of practice they experienced in the first 2 years of social work. So CCEs during this particular career stage prompted questions like, is the job what I thought it would be? And if not, do I still want to do this? Am I the right person for social work, and where do I fit within this profession? How do I align the classroom ideals with the realities of practice? To navigate CCEs, early career social workers required significant input from more experienced social workers, especially their team managers. In this sense, they greatly benefited from the generativity, as we've termed it, of more experienced workers. Identity work for early career social workers often involved internalizing messages about themselves and their practice from mentors, from team managers, and colleagues. So, while experienced workers tended to have a more established sense of professional identity and were less likely to assess the validity of feedback from their colleagues, by contrast, early career social workers were much more likely to personalise negative feedback. And a critical or unsupportive management style affected the way they thought about themselves. So, while good management and supervision are, of course, important for practitioners of all career stages, it was therefore particularly important for early career social workers' sense of professional identity. Early career social workers particularly valued hearing more experienced workers talk about their own resolved CCEs, experiences they'd had early in their career, and hearing how experienced workers navigated these identity challenges was really reassuring for newer social workers. It helped them to see that their present challenges were not a sign of a personal failing, but simply an aspect of practice that everyone goes through and that everyone can overcome. In addition, at the early career stage, the need for mobility has emerged as an unexpected finding, particularly for those social workers who'd found their first team or area of practice to be a poor fit. And we found that the first team in which early career social workers were placed has a real influence on their decision to stay or leave, because if it wasn't a good fit, they often assumed that social work as a whole was not right for them. Those who, despite a poor fit, went on to stay in the profession identified that what made the difference was being able to hear about other routes available to them within the local authority. Several discussed discovering that they were more cut out for adult rather than children's social work and vice versa, but often found themselves stuck where they started. Many social workers talked about peers in their qualifying cohort who had left during the first 2 years of practice due to their first role being a poor fit, and simply because they weren't aware of other options to move or other options available to them within the local authority. This suggests there may need to be a compromise between allowing mobility between areas in the local authority and loss from the local authority as a whole. And early career social workers really highlighted to us a need for greater information and support in social work during the first 2 years of practice. They identified that independent careers advice was really helpful to them. They wanted to have opportunities to hear later career social workers talk about their journeys through social work, to provide them with inspiration, to provide them with alternative ideas, particularly if the area they first entered was not a good fit. They may also be a role here for workforce development leads and the principal social worker in coordinating some of this careers advice for early career practitioners. Okay. So while it was difficult to quantify mid-career in terms of years, professionals tended to view themselves as mid-career when they'd moved out of the first 5 years of practice. During this stage, they began to feel more confident in their abilities and professional identity, and their support needs changed. So, whereas early career social workers' needs focused on developing a professional identity as a social worker, mid-career practitioners focused on the need to develop their professional identity through specialism. A specific kind of CCE emerged in the mid-career stage, which centred around feeling stuck and thinking, where next? As one social worker described, my CCEs, have been periods of frustration or itchy feet. When I look at my career progression, it's because a manager has said, are you aware there's this job? You've been talking about X, Y, or Z. I think you'd be really good at this, and encouraged me into it. So identity questions during this career stage included, how do I continue to develop as a professional and find meaning in my work? What are my areas of expertise and how can I specialise? So opportunities to develop a specialism were particularly important for mid-career social workers, and this was an important feature in their decision to remain in their local authority. At this career stage, social workers tended to seek out and move into more specialist roles, such as practice educator, supervisor, champion of a particular area of practice, such as a carer's champion, for instance. And our consultation with approved mental health professionals, a specialist and highly regulated role, highlighted how having a real specialism strengthened their sense of identity and intent to stay in the profession. Other practitioners described how the opportunity to develop a specialism reignited their passion for the work. It provided fresh motivation and could be a deciding factor in their intent to stay in the local authority. Mid-career social workers indicated to us they were really keen to be consulted on the development of specialist pathways, which reflected the needs of the communities in which they worked. They had a good idea of what the people with lived experience with whom they worked, what they needed, and so they were really keen to develop specialisms to reflect those needs. They also identified that matching passion with practice could be a mutually beneficial activity for local authorities and professionals. So mid-career social workers often moved several times during this career stage to develop a specialism or simply to maintain their interest in the work. So opportunities for mobility, so feeling that they could move within their local authority, prevented them from leaving their local authority. One local authority operated a transfer window initiative, as they called it, where expressions of interest were invited for other areas of the service. So to allow this mobility, whilst also ensuring service continuity, there were restrictions on the number of moves that employees could make per year. This was viewed really positively by the mid-career social workers who participated in our consultation, and they identified it as an important factor in their decision to remain in their local authority as an experienced social worker rather than to seek new experiences elsewhere. And finally, late career social workers. So late career social workers have been in practice for over a decade or more, some over 30 years, and typically they had really advanced social work skills. They had generally experienced a range of social work teams and had expertise in several areas of social work. Some had taken a management route, and those who had not taken a management route nevertheless provided vital support to their team managers as a peer. Late career social workers also played a vital yet often unrecognised role in supporting the retention, learning and development of less experienced colleagues. Late career social workers typically had a very strong sense of professional identity. So they typically moved around the CCE cycle depicted on the top right of the screen several times, or indeed in many cases tens or 20 times in one cases over the course of 40 years of a career. And it was fascinating to hear their experiences. Moving around this CC cycle, experiencing these challenges and resolving them prompted really deep identity work and deep learning. And resolving these challenges ultimately strengthened their professional identity over time. As one really experienced social worker described, during CCEs, I've learned I'm a social worker to the core, no matter what else I do. Strong values, social justice, passion for people. So when encountering new situations or supporting less experienced colleagues to do so, late career social workers drew on their wealth of accrued experience and learning, which helped them to manage new stresses from a position of deep practice wisdom and experience. And this perhaps helps to explain what we know from research, that highly experienced social workers are statistically less likely to leave the profession than their less experienced colleagues. However, while this accrued experience helped them to manage CCEs, sometimes late career social workers experienced a different kind of CCE, which centred around not being able to utilise their skills to benefit the workforce. So CCEs among late career social workers involved identity questions such as, how do I leave my mark on the profession? How can I make things better for the next generation of both practitioners and people with lived experience? Using their specialist skills to support the next generation enabled late career social workers to find continued meaning and ultimately sustain them in their work. They spoke with real passion and pride about supporting colleagues' development and described this as some of the most meaningful aspects of their career. They described how earlier in their career it was about being the best social worker that they could be, but later in their career it was about supporting the next generation to be the best that they could be. For instance, several experienced social workers talked about having the experience of nurturing their own social work student as an on-site supervisor or as a PE, and then a decade later seeing their student have a student of their own. This was such a powerful source of generativity and motivation. And the need for generativity at this career stage could be fulfilled in a number of ways. So it could be by mentoring new team managers, becoming a supervisor, becoming a manager, a practice educator, adopting a workforce development role, or simply by informally sharing one's learning with others. For many social workers, generativity involved supporting early career social workers to manage CCEs similar to those they had experienced themselves. And they spoke really vividly about taking a newly qualified social worker to one side, having a really important discussion with them about their experiences, what they went through and how they came out of it the other side. Late career social workers often had great institutional memory, particularly in relation to service redesign and service restructure. Many social workers with 20 years or more in practice had experienced several service restructures over the years, and this gave them a really unique insight into what worked, what didn't, and what organisational initiatives had previously been trialled. However, unless they progressed into strategic level management, they were very rarely consulted on workforce plans, which was a real shame and a lost opportunity from their perspective. So providing opportunities for late career social workers for generativity formed a virtuous circle. So it motivated these highly experienced social workers to stay, and it also allowed organisations to benefit from their accumulated knowledge and expertise. However, where late career social workers were not given opportunities for generativity, they often formed a resolution to leave the profession, often by taking early retirement. And this represented a hugely significant loss of expertise from their local authority. And generally, the expertise of late career social workers was underutilised because it was often simply unrecognised. So organisations were often unaware of the range of practice experience and the specialist skills among their late career practitioners. One social worker poignantly said, "I've worked in lots of different areas. I'll be retiring soon. And who knows what I've done for the last 30 years in the wider structure? What's the local authority doing with all of that expertise?" So for that reason, local authorities may find it useful to take a skills audit of their long-serving professionals. This could help map and capture untapped areas of practice expertise and help them to think creatively about how this expertise can be used within the organisation. It may also be useful for late career social workers to develop a closer relationship and dialogue with the workforce development team or the principal social worker to identify opportunities that creatively utilise their expertise. And finally, legacy mentoring schemes, which are more familiar in health and particularly the field of nursing, may provide a useful way for the workforce to benefit from the expertise of late career social workers. So legacy mentoring teams typically involve a program that pairs experienced professionals with early career professionals to provide support and guidance, skills coaching, and pastoral support to early career social workers. So drawing together these findings and recommendations from the two studies leads to our theory of change, which is depicted on the slide there. So moving from left to right, a theory of change identifies the need for and purpose of an intervention. In this case, it's to improve the retention of local authority social workers. Participants in this intervention will be social workers, especially managers, but also HR, workforce development and principal social workers who may have a greater role to play in coordinating independent careers advice for newly qualified social workers, developing specialist career pathways for mid-career social workers, and working closely alongside late career practitioners to harness their expertise within the workforce. The intervention at the heart of this theory of change is two-pronged. The first is support to manage CCEs, which involves a recognition of risk factors, the need for debrief and ongoing support to manage CCEs, as well as opportunities to reflect on and generate learning from these experiences. And the research report that accompanies this presentation and is available in the chat contains some details and activities that are helpful in this regard. Secondly, the intervention involves offering opportunities for specialism, generativity and mobility, recognising that these needs may vary according to career stage. And a really important point, I think, is that social worker support needs don't reduce across the career span, they change. So thinking about what is needed at different career stages is key. We also suggest that local authorities consult social workers to identify relevant practice pathways during this process. And taken together, these interventions contribute to the intermediate outcome of strengthening professional identity among social workers across the career span, leading to greater use of knowledge and practice wisdom within local authorities. The necessary conditions for these interventions are a culture of psychological safety, the availability of third spaces, and support for team managers. Ultimately, at its heart, this theory of change suggests that strengthening professional identity and meeting the identity needs of workers is key to improving the retention of local authority social workers across the career span. So to summarise then, what we've aimed to do in this research is to provide a new theoretical framework to address and conceptualise the retention of local authority social workers. And we've learnt a great deal from speaking to social workers from a range of local authorities and across the career span, and particularly our late career social workers, who are often generally quite underrepresented in research. And I mentioned also that there may be some relevance of these findings to think about retention in areas outside of social work, and would be interesting from hearing from professionals from occupational therapy and so on who might be interested in exploring these ideas. And something about this idea of the CCE, when we've talked about this research to different groups, has really resonated with people. So we hope that's been useful. As I said, the research report contains detailed recommendations for local authorities and practice tools that you may find useful. And finally, I want to genuinely thank the 109 social workers across the 12 local authorities who so generously shared their experience with us and had the courage to be vulnerable in sharing these often quite difficult experiences they had throughout the course of their career. So thank you. Thank you for your attention, and I believe we now have just a little bit of time, 5 minutes or so, for me to take a couple of questions from the audience. Oh, and thank you. I can see some applause and hearts there. That's lovely. Thank you.
Yes, lots of reactions there, Laura. Thank you so much. That was a really interesting session. We have got a couple of minutes, which is great, and we've got some questions to put to you, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, so the first question that we've had is with regard to supervision often being case focused rather than on the individual practitioner. Do you think having case supervision and professional career supervision as being two separate meetings would be helpful?
I think that's a really good question. I think that ideally, good supervision would involve both. So it would always involve a case discussion, but also would involve opportunities to think about professional development needs, opportunities to think about personal elements, particularly when discussing a CCE. So ideally, but also the social workers that we talked to in the study were really realistic. And I think social workers are great realists, and they were saying that that's the ideal. Within the time constraints of supervision, that isn't always possible. So that was where the idea of these third spaces came in, and the idea that it's helpful to have somewhere else outside of case-focused supervision where you really have the space to delve into a CCE and check in about it. So I think it's both. I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's both, if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks ever so much for that. And another question we've got on this, and this might connect with that a little bit, is how might the use of reflective spaces, including peer review, support a critical career episode? So it's having that additional space outside of the standard supervision, I think.
Yes, absolutely. So to give an example, one of the local authorities that where we were consulting with social workers had a third space in this way. This was a particular third space that was aimed at newly qualified social workers. It wasn't explicitly for the purposes of CCEs, but that was often what it ended up being used for. So newly qualified social worker or social workers in the first 2 years of practice were invited to attend from across the local authority. And so it was a peer group, even though they had that degree of independence because they didn't work with each other, and it was facilitated by an experienced social worker. In those sessions, they were invited to take the lead, to share anything that had come up from them. And it was within that that these discussions of CCEs arose quite powerfully. And because they met regularly, they could then kind of check in and have that review. Sometimes social workers were getting that in their teams, but not always. And that is where that third space was so important. I'd also say, in terms of facilitating groups to think about CCEs, we learned an awful lot as a team from doing this as part of the research. So we invited social workers to come into the research space to share their experiences with us. We didn't quite anticipate just how powerful a space that would be, and what social workers were hanging on to actually in terms of things that they had put to one side for various reasons and needed to look at. So one of the things that came through really strongly was the need to really think about follow-up, signposting, and making sure that that was a really safe space for social workers. And sometimes there was a lot of discussion about, social workers found really helpful about, how do I take this back to the team? How do I discuss this with my manager in a safe way? So it was a very important third space. In terms of what sessions could look like, and in terms of how to reflect on CCEs, we've devised some tools that might be helpful for that. So one of the things that we got social workers to do, and this was just such an interesting experience, was to map critical career episodes across the timeline of their career. And then there was a reflective exercise around drawing out the learning. So in some cases, this was about managing difficult feelings. In other cases, it was about drawing out learning, and a great deal of expertise had been achieved for social workers as a result of going through these experiences. So in the research report, we've suggested some specific tools that or ways that facilitators could go about structuring these sessions. And another idea that we had as well alongside the social workers was some goldfish bowl type activities, as we call them, where we get to experienced social workers who are sufficiently resolved enough to talk about their CCs, to share some difficult experiences they'd had earlier in their career, and then the outer circle to ask questions about those experiences. So in short, lots of different ideas. I'll direct you to the research report on that one. And if you use any of those ideas or find them helpful, we would love to hear from you, to hear how that's been going. I think that answers your question.
That was brilliant. Yeah, thanks so much for that. And as Laura said there, we've shared some links as well to those studies, so people can have a look at those after the session. Hopefully we've got time for this question as well. So it's a question in response to discussion around social workers being in that early career space, and the risks around that in that first 2 years of practice, and imposter syndrome, and all the things that you discussed there, and team managers and experienced social workers being key to supporting that risk at that point. And the question is, how might hybrid working impact upon that, given we're not all in the office together, we're not all, sharing our spaces together, where that might not be as accessible as it once was?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and something that came up in terms of the 12 different local authorities. What we learnt was there is a whole range of approaches in terms of whether it's hybrid, whether people are in the office all the time, whether some people are not in the office at all. So I think we're kind of post-COVID, if we want to use that term. It's a variable landscape. So we've done quite a lot of work in this area actually at UEA in different areas. So I can point you to some things that might be helpful. So one of the things that we've looked at the University of East Anglia is how teams create a secure base for social workers. We know this is important for all social workers, but we know it's particularly important for social workers in the first 2 years of practice. And there's a real risk, as your commenter has said, that social workers in the early stages are not getting those opportunities for vicarious learning, just listening to conversations from experienced social workers in the office. And it's harder to phone somebody up than it is to say, oh, can I have a quick chat over a coffee when they're in the office? So one of the things we've worked on at UEA is developing the Teams as a secure-based model, along with my colleague Laura Bigart. I can put some links to this if it would be helpful. And a recent thing that we did was adapt this and put together a toolkit for thinking about how to create secure-based teams in hybrid environments specifically, which are using that combination and of in-person. A lot of it is about signalling one's availability, because it sounds like a straightforward thing, but actually we found that for newly qualified social workers, there is more so for them than other groups. There's a real internal barrier to reaching out for support and thinking, oh, I'm bothering somebody, or they're going to think I'm anxious, or I don't know what I'm doing. That's preventing them from reaching out when they're at home or they're working online. So teams where they had a culture of signalling their availability. So even if it was, I've got my green light on if I'm available for a chat, or there's kind of a virtual water cooler or check-in that happens anyway. It's a routine part of online work, was so important in making sure that those early career social workers were not becoming marginalized and invisible within their teams. And I think increasingly now, I think for many teams there is a real push to think about times of the week when most team members are present and newly qualified team members are in the office too. So I think we've got some more toolkit and ideas on that, but that's just a little summary really of but I think it's a really important question, particularly for newly qualified.
Great question. Thank you so much, Laura, for that. That's all we've got time for today in this session. We hope you enjoyed it today. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.